welcome to Glacier Wolf Media presents an audiobook for Diadem Worlds of Magic, the first book in the series titled Book of Names by John Peel. This is a very little known series of books that came out originally in the late 90s and then were reprinted in the 2000s. And I want to shed some light on this series. So let's begin. For my nephews, Jonathan and Simon, and for my niece and goddaughter, Allison. Prologue. The shadows were out hunting, far from home. In a pack they moved through the spaces between the many worlds, seeking their prey. It couldn't just be anyone. It had to be the right victim, the correct sacrifice. They all anticipated the thrill of the hunt and the final taking. This was not merely their job. It was their sport. It was their pleasure. They enjoyed finding their targets, and they felt a genuine thrill as their victim was dragged off to its fate. The shadows, not quite faces, seemed to wrinkle with laughter and pleasure. As they closed in on one small green and blue planet, they could feel that this was the one. Here they would find their next victim. Here on a small, backward, off-the-beaten-path planet named Earth. Here the right prey lived, for the moment. Sliding unseen and unsuspected into the atmosphere of the planet, they began to close in on their chosen target. They left a trail of chilled air behind them, like the contrails of a jet aircraft, as they spiraled down, 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 toward the waiting land below. All their senses felt as if they were on fire. Over the ocean they sped, zeroing in on one small island, a tiny place called Manhattan, perched on a small rock above the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. There they would find the right person. There the sacrifice awaited. They were ready and eager. Soon, very soon, they could take their prey. Chapter 1. Score was scared. It was the one emotion he knew really well. He'd lived with it for most of his short life. He reckoned he must have been born scared because he couldn't ever recall spending a single day when he wasn't afraid. It had been his father, mostly, who had scared Score. Tony Caruso was a mean, tough guy, and even on the streets the word had been out that nobody messed with Tony Caruso and lived to brag about it. His was a name that even whispered scared gang members, mobsters, and even cops all over Lower Manhattan. Tony Caruso was bad, and the capital letter was there as a warning. Then, just 2 weeks ago, everything had changed. Bad Tony had done something wrong again, but this time the police took him away. Usually he managed to pay off someone, or to get away from the police somehow, but not this time. He'd slipped up, and the police had solid evidence on him. Score didn't much care as long as they kept his father away from him for a long, long time. Score found himself alone, going through everything in their small apartment. He managed to find some money that Bad Tony had hidden. Then, behind a loose board in Bad Tony's bedroom, he found a letter that had never been mailed. On the front was his name and address. Puzzled, he stared at it. The handwriting looked familiar, but it wasn't his father's. It was his mother's. She'd been dead for 3 years, but Score remembered her well. She had been another of Bad Tony's victims, another reason to hate his father. Excitement mounted in Score as he opened the envelope and took out the sheet of paper within. Unfolding it, he began to read. It made no sense to him whatsoever. Some of it seemed to make sense, but really didn't. Treen is the start, for example. Who Or what was Treen? And what was he, she, or it the start of? Score simply didn't understand. Why would his mother want him to have something like this? Something he couldn't understand? She must have hidden it for him to find one day. If she felt it was important, maybe he'd figure out what it meant somehow. He carefully folded it and slipped it into the wallet of money he had found. With the money, he planned to start a new, improved life. Then the police had taken Score as well. Not under arrest. Well, they hadn't called it that, but he had been taken in front of a judge, who'd placed him in the custody of the Children's Services people. It wasn't arrest because they claimed to be doing everything for his own good, including locking him up when he had tried to escape. But this time, he'd not only tried, he'd succeeded. So now, he was back where he belonged, on the Bowery in New York City. Score was scared here, too. But at least he knew the streets and the dangers. There were gangs to watch out for. And other people might hold his father's actions against him, but at least he had a chance, since he was on his own turf. There was another thing that was scaring him, and one he had no control over. For the past week, he'd been having a reoccurring dream. It confused and worried him because it made absolutely no sense. He would hear, over and over again, a repeated tune. It wasn't anything he had ever heard before, or anything he'd ever choose to listen to. It was slow and kind of mournful, the kind of music you might hear at a funeral, like at his mother's funeral. He couldn't get the tune out of his mind. The dream always ended in a flash of green light, pulsing slightly, drawing him toward it. The light was like a promise, a beacon. Score always reached for it, wanting it so that he could be rich and happy forever. But when he touched it, he felt an abrupt shock. He would immediately wake up, shaking and sweating. Why was he having this dream over and over? Was he sick? Was it maybe some kind of warning? He didn't really believe in dreams being able to warn you, but this bothered him. Maybe it was a warning. But about what? His stomach growled, reminding him that he needed food. He had a few dollars left from the money he'd managed to scrape together, but he'd need a lot more to survive on his own. There was no point in going back to the crummy apartment he lived in until 2 weeks ago. Too many bad memories hung over that place. There were probably other people living there now, and besides, the police would be bound to look for him there. He had no place to call home anymore. He needed money, and that meant only one possibility. There was one thing that Score was really good at, scamming the scam artists. They worked the streets, picking on tourists, and trying to get money away from them. Score's favorite was the old 3-card Monty. The scam artist would have 3 cards face down. One was always the Queen of Spades. To win money, the tourists had to guess which card was the Queen. They never managed it, of course, because usually the scammer palmed the card and replaced it with a different one. Somehow, though, that never happened with Score. He always managed to pick the right card. As a result, he could win money, but he had to be careful never to hit the same dealer twice. Luck was with him. He found a tall, hyperactive hustler working one of the streets on the edge of Chinatown, keeping up a stream of patter, jokes, and wide grins as he shuffled and twisted his 3 cards on a small table. "Come on," he begged the passing tourists. "It's easy, don't you see? Just pick the Queen and I give you $20. Only $5 to try. Come on, you can do it." "I can," Score said, confidently taking out his last 5 and placing it on the table. "All right," the dealer exclaimed, obviously figuring he was reeling in a sucker. "Here you go, my man. Watch the cards carefully." Score didn't bother. He didn't need to try and follow those flying fingers as they shuffled the 3 cards. A couple of curious tourists stopped to watch, smiling at him from behind their cameras. "Now, which one is it?" the dealer asked, grinning. Everyone watched as Score paused. It was mostly for show. Score knew which card it was. He didn't know how, he just knew. "This one," he said, seeing the momentary flare of triumph in his opponent's eyes, knowing Score was wrong. Score turned over the Queen of Spades. The wide grin vanished. Huh? $20, Score said, holding out the card to the startled cheat. The man looked like he was going to complain, but the tourists were laughing and encouraging Score. The dealer couldn't afford to alienate potential victims. Well done, my man, he said, trying to pull on a good face. He peeled a bill from a roll in his pocket and handed it across. He was still obviously unsure how Score had done what he'd done. Want to try again? Double or quits? Sure, agreed Score. The growing crowd laughed and encouraged him. The dealer's hands flew like lightning this time, but not fast enough to confuse Score. That one, Score said confidently. He reached for the card he'd indicated, but the dealer beat him to it. This time, eyes grinning as he flipped over the card he knew couldn't be the Queen of Spades. The crowd had held its breath, and now started to applaud. The dealer looked stunned, and then ready to kill. But he had no option, since everyone was watching. He peeled off another bill and handed it over. Again? Score jeered. The man wanted to refuse. He didn't understand what was happening here. Neither did the crowd, which was now about 20 strong. But they were on the side of the underdog, the kid who was winning at the game. If the dealer backed down, he might as well go home. He'd get no money from them. But if he agreed, and somehow, impossibly, Score won again. How are you doing it, kid? He asked, playing for time. Luck? Score suggested. A new voice, mellow and amused, came from over his shoulder.
It is not luck, but skill, my friend, that leads to winning in the end.
Huh? Score turned around to see who was speaking in rhymes to him. His eyes opened wide at the sight of the tall man. He was dressed entirely in black, shirt, trousers, and boots. His hair was black, and his pale skin seemed to flicker. Who are you? Score asked. The man looked outrageous, and yet there was something somehow familiar about him, like he'd met the man before. Maybe he was an associate of Bad Tony?
Call me Licora, if you will, and I'll explain your special skill.
The weird man reached over to the table where the Monte dealer's cards were. He turned to look Score carefully in the face.
There is one thing I must reveal. The gift you have is very real. The Black Queen goes just where you choose. With magic, you can never lose.
As the stranger spoke, the dealer turned over all the cards on the table. They were all the Queen of Spades. Nobody watching understood what was going on, least of all Score. How could that be? He only picked one card. Licora saw his astonishment and explained again.
The power to change things in small ways will be with you for all your days.
Score began to understand. Despite the man's rather roundabout way of explaining things, he didn't have the power to pick where the card was. He had the ability to change any card he picked into the Queen of Spades. Hey, the dealer growled angrily. You been ripping me off, kid. He lunged for Score and the money. Score's fingers clutched his $45, and he whirled and ran for his life, dodging through the crowd. The dealer, yelling furiously, tried to follow, but he was larger, and the crowd didn't part for him. Once Score was sure he'd escaped the Monte dealer, he slowed down and then stood, panting in a side street. That had been close, but he was free again, and now with money in his pocket. Score still didn't understand what had happened. The appearance of the flickering man, the business with the cards. Was it possible that the stranger was right? That somehow Score had the power to change small things? He didn't know, but there was one real easy way to find out. His fingers closed in on the $5 bill in his pocket. If he could change an ace to the Queen of Spades, then this should be just as easy. Unsure of what to do, Score simply closed his eyes and concentrated, and then withdrew the $5 bill from his pocket. He crumpled it and then stared down at it. Ben Franklin's face stared back at him. "All right!" Score felt excited, confused, and a bit scared. He changed a $5 bill into 100 just by thinking about it. How? He had no idea, but he'd done it once and could do it again, whenever he felt like it. Score felt like a winner at last. Above Score, unseen in the air, the shadows hovered. There was their victim, ready and waiting, and all alone. Together they laughed and then plunged earthward, seeking out host bodies. This far from the center, they were invisible. They needed other people to do their work for them. Still, that was no real problem. It had been planned, after all. There, in the next block over, was a gang of street thugs, showing off their knives. It took a mere seconds for the shadows to slip within their bodies and their minds. Then they informed their unwitting hosts about the presence of one small, weedy boy with money just a block away. The gang began to move without a word. Score grinned to himself as he turned the two 20s into $100 bills. Not a bad salary for 10 seconds of work. $5 into 300. Just like that. No more scrimping and begging and stealing for him. He suddenly realized he was not alone. The street he was in was narrow, with sky-high buildings, cramped together on either side. Trash cans, bags of half-open garbage, and abandoned litter boxes was on the street, and at the far end, a gang of 7 young men suddenly appeared. There were glints of silver that were obviously knives, and Score realized he was in serious trouble. The boys belonged to the Zaps, one of the most dangerous of the street gangs in the area. Score didn't belong to any gangs. For one thing, he was too young to join them. For another, they scared him. But not belonging to a gang meant you were fair gang if one of them caught you on their turf. Just like these Zaps had caught him. Hey, Score said weakly. The gang members said nothing, just moved slowly, purposefully toward him. There was something wrong with their eyes. They looked entirely black, as if someone had spilled paint into them, and their faces were expressionless, which made it even scarier. Normally, they would be laughing and taunting their victim before jumping him. They'd steal whatever he had that was worth their while, his $300, and then rough him up a bit. But their faces were all wrong. Their weapons held too ready for that. These punks weren't going to rob him. They were going to kill him. There was no choice left for him. Score whirled around and ran for his life. The gang members raced after him in concentrated silence. The short street led to another, and Score hurriedly dashed down it. There was nobody around to help, just a couple of derelicts drinking from bottles and paper bags, ignoring the world in a self-induced haze. Panicking, his legs tiring, his lungs on fire, Score ripped around the next corner and into another street. He heard the gang's footsteps close behind him. He knew he was in really serious trouble. This ended in a blockade, topped with barbed wire. Beyond it lay the East River. There were no other turnoffs, nowhere to look for a hiding place. Score was trapped, a dead end. He turned, and the gang was there, their weapons at the ready. They slowly advanced on him. Now, it was time. The shadows could feel the surge of energy. They could also taste the delicious fear radiating from their target as their host bodies closed in. And then it happened. Score whirled around as there was an explosion of sound from behind him, behind the East River barricade. His jaw fell open at what he saw. He was unable to move. Stunned by the shape that hurled from the water into the air and fly over the top of a 10-foot barrier without trouble. Even drenched by the tremendous splash, Score just stood, shocked senseless, and stared. It was a killer whale, maybe 20 feet long, black, and with a white underbelly and patches of white on its sleek, dark skin. What was a killer whale doing in the East River? Or more accurately, leaping out of it? The huge beast opened its wide jaws as it hurled down from the top of its arc toward the ground. Then things got really weird. It began to shrink, growing legs and arms. Just when it looked as if it would hit the road, the whale somehow morphed into a roughly human form, landing lightly on two muscular legs. The man, if that's what it was, stood over 7 feet tall and looked strong and very, very dangerous. He was still black, with a white stomach and blotches. "Back!" the creature howled at the gang members, who had watched in stunned silence. They had turned to Score and beckoned. "To me, if you want to save your miserable life." Score was scared of the big man and was still shaken and confused by what he had seen. But he wasn't stupid. He knew that this was his only chance of survival. Here was to do as the creature had suggested. Quickly, he ran to stand behind him. It was time. The shadows suddenly leapt with one mind out of their host bodies, freeing the gang members to do as they willed. Hovering unseen above, the shadows watched what happened next. The gang members looked as though they were waking up from some kind of nightmare. Life suddenly returned to their eyes as they became normal again. And then they stared in horror at the beast defending Score, as if they hadn't seen him before and had no idea what was going on. "Back!" the stranger commanded. "This boy is under my protection." "Yeah?" whispered Score, still not certain he trusted the stranger. "And just what are you?" "I am she," the whatever he was answered, as if that were enough. It wasn't, not for the gang at least. Despite their shock, they all screamed and tried to jump the creature at once. Like lightning, she was on them, kicking and punching with incredible strength and skill. Score couldn't even make out what was happening. She moved that fast. Score saw one gang member go down, his arm clearly broken, his knife rattling away. The toughs pulled back after their first attack failed. The one boy was down, moaning with his broken arm. 2 of the others had long cuts across exposed skin, and one held his left arm, clearly in pain. She was untouched, but panting slightly. He'd done very well so far, but he was still unarmed and the gang had knives. Then one of them drew a large silver pistol. "Let's go!" she yelled with his left arm. He scooped Score up without effort. With his right, he ripped at the strands of wire, tearing a hole in the fence. As the gun fired, Score heard the first bullet narrowly miss them. Then she was on the barrier, and he tensed for a second before throwing himself and Score forward toward the waiting East River. The gang members dashed forward, furious that their prey was escaping. 2 of them managed to mount the barrier and stare down at the river. Their faces were filled with confusion and shock. There had been no splash as their targets hit the water, and as they stared down, they could see the water was still, lapping gently against the rocks. There was no sign of anyone having entered the water at all, and no sign of the black and white creature or the boy. They had vanished completely and mysteriously. But how? And to where?